Okay, here's a quick view of the process of making the clear wraps. So you can see here we've got the white wraps with the chartreuse trim. This is just a straight standard guide that's in the middle of one of the rod sections, so I wanted to do the clear finish on this. So I have my rod finisher epoxy mixed up, and then you just add the denatured alcohol to it. So if you have 2 milliliters each of the epoxy, you would add a 2 milliliters of denatured alcohol would give you this thin mixture that gives you the clear wraps. And you don't want to paint this on. You want to get a drip on your brush and just kind of touch your blank just off the threads and let it soak into the threads. And you want to work from outside into the guide on both sides. So that's so you don't get any air bubbles trapped. And you really want it to, rather than brush on, you want the epoxy to just kind of let the threads pull the epoxy off of the brush. So take your time, and you see me not really do any strokes, and I'm really hardly ever even touching the brush to the threads themselves. You want to kind of keep it in a wet portion and slowly move it over, because if you get air bubbles in there, they're going to show up as like a little shimmery spot in an otherwise clear finish, and it won't look very good. So you just kind of slowly take your time and work it over until it's fully coated. And then you want to let this sit. I'm going to let it spin for a couple hours, but probably want it to sit 24 hours before you put your finish coat. And then your finish coat will be just the standard equal parts rod finisher epoxy. And that'll go over the top of this, and that'll give you the nice clear wraps. And then my chartreuse wraps trim bands will show up as kind of like a translucent chartreuse. So just finish this side up. Hopefully you can pick that up on camera. And then get a fair amount around the guide foot, because you want to create a seal, especially if you're going to saltwater fish. You want to get a nice seal with epoxy around the guide foot. So just make sure you're not skimping around that spot. And that, once it's soaked through, I'll actually touch that guide foot with the brush to make sure that I get some on there. So that looks pretty good on that side. So I'll go on to this side, and again I'm going to start from the outside and work towards the guide foot, or towards the guide itself, and just slowly let it soak in. Once the thread is started, and it has started soaking it in, you pretty much just keep your brush right on the edge of the part that is wet, and it'll keep slowly absorbing into the dry thread, and that'll keep you free from air bubbles. that's that. Just do that on all the wraps that you want to keep clear. That's your first coat. Okay, and then once you have all your clear threads saturated so that they'll be totally translucent, you can put some color protector on your threads that you want to keep their color. So in my case, my ferrule wraps, my winding check at the grip, and also some thread wraps at the tip top. I've done one coat already. You need to do 2 to 3 coats. Basically, once a coat, or once the threads turn back to their normal color, then you can add the second coat. And then after you have your 2 to 3 coats, you want to wait 24 hours before you put your rod wrap finish epoxy, as your final coat. So you can knock out your 3 coats of this real fast, and then do your clear rod wraps with their first coat, and then wait till the next day, and then go ahead and put your finished coat on the whole thing. I like to try and do it in one shot like that, so I'm not waiting for the rod forever. So here's the color protector that's included in the kit. It's a Rod Dancer Chroma Seal. Works pretty good when I've used it in the past. You're going to do this a lot like the way you did the first coat on the clear wraps. As you can see, my clear wraps here were white, and then after I was done they were totally clear. And so now I have this ferrule wrap is what I want to use the color protector on. So you're going to do it pretty much the same way as that clear finish, where you don't really want to paint it on. You want to let the thread kind of grab it off the brush and absorb it in and work, from one side to the other. This stuff doesn't have as much of a tendency to catch air bubbles, so you will see me brush this a little bit. I don't think it's as important on this color protector to just purely let it soak in. It's got kind of a white color to it, so I kind of get right around the trim band. Is a thin circle, and then I'll kind of widen out my brush and let it do its thing. Get some wider strokes. But I'm kind of still staying in the wet portion and just slowly moving it over into the dry portion. Trying to let it absorb it to move it over as much as possible rather than brush it. But the bristles of the brush are actually touching the threads in this process. Like I said, this doesn't create as much of a seal as the thread epoxy, so it doesn't tend to trap the air bubbles like that does. But this is pretty much it. We'll just get this one done. You want it to be fairly saturated. I mean, you don't need to go crazy or anything, but fairly saturated, so if you can get away with 2 coats, you can get away with 2 coats. And how I usually tell with my coats if I didn't get enough in a spot is as it starts to dry, you'll have some spots that are obviously drier than the rest of the wrap, and then that means that you probably got it on a little too thin in that spot. It should take about 20 minutes or so to return to its original color completely. And a little difference in color here or there is normal, but if you've got a spot that looks much drier after a few minutes than the rest of the wraps, then you for sure are going to want to do another coat and make sure you get that spot. Because you can not get this saturated enough, and when you go to put your finish epoxy on, you'll end up with a splotch that looks wet where the epoxy is soaking into the threads, which this is supposed to stop, and that means that you probably didn't get enough of the color protector in that spot. So you want to make sure you get it good enough. You might as well do 3 coats just to be sure. It doesn't take an incredibly long time to do, because it's, at least in my case here, it's only four wraps or so that need it. So doing another coat takes another 5-10 minutes, and a little insurance policy against screwing it up. Just get all the way out to the end, a little bit of overlap onto the blank. Same thing with your epoxy. Create that seal at the edge. But that looks pretty good. So just like that, I'll go ahead and finish the rest off camera, and then we will be back tomorrow once this is ready to do the finish coat. And the only step in between that and now is going to be, once this stuff dries, you might find, particularly on your clear finish, little peaks and valleys. If you had a little fuzzy trim end that you couldn't quite get and that was sticking up, that'll show up as a little bump in the finish. Little high spots or whatever from when you were applying the epoxy. That stuff's going to happen, especially from the fuzz, the fuzzy trim ends that didn't totally tuck in under the rest of the threads. You just take a razor and you cut them off flush with the rest of the epoxy, and then you'll just finish over the top of that, and that will look totally fine. It's normal. So once this is hard, we'll look at all these wraps, trim off any high spots, and then we'll be ready for the finish coat. Okay, so the finish coating is now done. We're just waiting for it to dry. The finish coat goes on just like that first coat. Just making sure to just get a very thin layer over everything, and then let it self-level. Get just enough to cover all the threads, and then slowly spread it around, and then after 5 minutes or so, the spinning of the rod allows the thread finisher to self-level. And so you can see, if you get too much on a wrap or too much on the blank, you'll get humps. It'll be more of a bald look to it, and not that it really hurts anything. It's just not really what you're looking for typically, as far as how it looks. So this turned out pretty good, I think. I'm pretty happy with it. Go ahead and let this cure for 24 hours or so before we take it out to the yard and cast it. You can see the clear wraps turned out nice and clear as I lose focus. And then the ferrule wraps with the trim bands look really good. I'd say the one thing that I'm not, super happy with is my trim bands on the clear wraps. You can tell this close, you can see them, but they're pretty light. And I should have maybe gone with the darker color. Would have shown up a little bit better, because it's a lot of work to put those in for, just a little bit of reward here. They're not super easy to see on this rod, especially when you get, more than, a foot or two away from it. You can't really tell that those are actually threaded into the thread wraps. So, but other than that, it looks pretty good. Looks like everything is smoothing out here the way it should, and should be good when it's done. Just going to go down and show a quick look at the different guides, and so you can see how they look as it goes down the rod. As I get closer to the tip, that's where it's a little harder to get a small enough amount of finish on the threads. And you can see, I get just a little bit more of a bulb look as opposed to a flat finish. Looking through the camera looks a little worse, it seems to me, than in real life, but